What is the best advertising stunt in history? So not just a flashy advert. For my money, that would be something like the Guinness adverts, the surfer. Or that tango advert that had Harrier jump jets.
Tango! Come and get me!
No, I'm talking about something that goes above and beyond to prove the capability of a product. So my mind is instantly drawn to the Volkswagen Beetle, which was sent to Antarctica with the Australian Antarctic Research Expedition in the 1960s, and it ended up being this amazing advertising boon for Volkswagen, who were able to prove the capabilities of the small and humble Volkswagen Beetle in one of the most hostile, extreme environments on Earth. Or perhaps there's the Blend Tech Will It Blend series, where I think the CEO of this blender company would blend all sorts of bizarre objects to prove the capabilities of his blenders, and he always said, "Don't breathe this." But sometimes I think the best test for this is how it sounds out loud. Our car is so tough you can send it to Antarctica and it'll still work. Our watch is so waterproof we can send it to the bottom of the Mariana Trench with James Cameron and it'll still work. Or our insulation is so good that we can drive a block of ice through the Sahara Desert and it won't melt.
Siste hånd på forberedelsene. 800 kilo glassvatt pakkes rundt isblokken. Her karene som skal bringe den trygt fram. Den franske sjåføren Cornet, den norske lederen ingeniør Klevan og den svenske sjåføren Kristoffersson. Og så går startskuddet for langturen.
So it's the autumn of 1958, and one of Europe's most popular radio stations, Radio Luxembourg, proposes a challenge, or maybe just a thought experiment. Would it be possible to transport a 3-ton block of ice from the Arctic Circle all the way down to the equator by truck without using any form of refrigeration? And for every kilo of ice that remained when they crossed the finish line, they would pay 100,000 French francs. Now, obviously conversion rates and everything are a bit weird, but that's about £1,600 in today's British pounds, or about $2,000 per kilo. But as Radio Luxembourg were looking for participants to take part in this ice block challenge, one of the people who found out about it was the PR manager at Scania Vabis, a very famous Swedish truck automotive manufacturer. And this manager, Kai Sandell, worked out that it would be a great promotional activity for their new line of trucks, the L75 truck that had just come online that year, around the year before. Now, obviously, the first thing that Kai was trying to figure out was how to get as far as possible without the ice melting. And that's when he started reaching out to local glass wool and insulation manufacturers. And one of those companies was Glasvad. Now, at Glasvad, the manager there, Birger Natvig, and his team calculated something that Radio Luxembourg probably hadn't considered. They worked out that a coating of just 25 centimetres of well-optimised, well-packed insulation around the exterior of this 3-ton block of ice would not just get it through Europe, it would get it all the way to the equator with, according to their calculations, as little as 10% of the overall volume melting away. Now remember, Radio Luxembourg had promised 100,000 French francs for every kilo that crossed the finish line. And based on these calculations, they would be paying out millions and millions of French francs to the potential winners of this expedition. The realization of this prompted Radio Luxembourg to swiftly and probably wisely rescind any offer of prize money. But by this point, the consortium of companies, Scania Vabis and Glasvat and other people who had been contacted about this potential expedition, realized that the prize money was secondary to the potential advertising boon this could create, driving a block of ice through the Sahara Desert. So, prize money or not, the block of ice was going to the equator. You know, I found out about this crazy ice block expedition purely because I have been doing a lot of research on insulation at the moment, because I am currently insulating the house that I'm building here on the Isle of Raasay. And it has been a lot of reading and researching about thermal envelopes, insulation properties, all aimed towards building a more sustainable house that can keep down energy bills. And it's got me thinking a lot recently about the environment. Now, that is why I have joined, and I'm proud to say that this video is supported by our friends at Planetwild. Planetwild is a nature protection organisation that is funded by us, the community. Think of it as crowdfunding for conservation. And every month, the Planetwild community funds a new carefully chosen mission. It could be restoring forests, protecting an endangered species, or cleaning up the oceans. And what I love is the transparency of it. You can see what your membership is directly funding. Planetwild documents their missions on YouTube and their website, and you can watch and keep up to date with the real-world impact your contributions are making. As you may know, as you can see from the view behind me, I live on a beautiful Scottish island on the west coast of the Scottish Highlands. It is probably one of the most beautiful places on Earth, and the natural world, as a result, is a big part of my day-to-day life. I mean, if you've watched my video before, you might remember one that I made walking through my own land, showing the scale of destruction that has been wrought by invasive rhododendron, which choke out just an unfathomably large section of Scottish wildlands now, and they are only spreading and getting worse with every passing day. So I was quite excited to see something quite close to home when Planetwild had their own mission with a very surprising but quite effective way of restoring Scotland's ancient woodlands. Now, you can contribute whatever amount feels right to you. You can also gift a membership to friends or family. And the first 100 people who sign up using my code Callum3 will get their first month paid for by me. And if you'd prefer to just get an idea of what Planetwild are doing before you join, you can just go to their YouTube channel, see their past work and their past missions. I'll leave a link in the description below and at the end of this video in an end card to that video I mentioned about their mission to help restore some of Scotland's ancient woodlands. So thanks again for the support, Planetwild, and let's get back to the video on the isblock expedition. Good talk. High in the hills upon one of Norway's largest glaciers, with temperatures plunging to negative 40 degrees centigrade, hundreds of kilograms of ancient pure Arctic ice were being carefully selected and extracted for the expedition. Each block was cut and extracted using chainsaws, then hauled over the ice by sled and bulldozer, attached to the underside of a helicopter, and then flown amid the wild January snowstorms down to the nearby settlement of Mo i Rana, where each of the 125 kilogram cuttings would be combined together to fuse into a single huge 3,000 kilogram block to be loaded onto the back of the waiting lorry. The ice would sit on a specially constructed pan fitted with sharp cross members on the base. An electrical current was passed through the metal, melting the cross members into the base of the ice and securing it firmly in place for the journey. This pan would also collect and divert any meltwater into onboard tanks so that any losses could be meticulously tracked along the way. Around the block were then draped sheets of closely fitting insulating material before being encased in a specially constructed steel box. Finally, in the gap between the outer metal box and the ice block, thick layers of glass wool were then carefully packed inside. The expedition would be made up of 3 vehicles, though only 2 officially. There was the L75 Scania, loaded with the block and various supplies for the journey. Travelling with it was a Volkswagen bus, which would act as the sleeping quarters for the men, and laden with clothing, spare parts, food, water, tents, a portable compressor, filming equipment, and numerous other supplies. Perhaps the most unusual of the vehicles, however, was a small Porsche 356. The car belonged to Inge Nilsson, the owner of the Swedish haulage firm that had supplied the L75. Inge and his friend Walter Lörkvist decided to join the convoy in Sweden, their small road car being otherwise unmodified except for a set of wheels and tyres taken from a bus to provide better traction. There would be 6 official crew. Sivert Klevan was the expedition leader and representative of Norway's Glassfelt Insulation Company. Alongside him were the 2 main drivers, one Swedish, supplied by the truck's owner, and one French, who would act as a liaison for the large areas of French-administered Africa that they would pass through. There was also a chief mechanic supplied by Scania Vabis, a film photographer responsible for documenting the expedition for Scania's PR department, and the journalist and photographer Sverre Børresen, who would later go on to write the book that I've had to painstakingly Google Translate over the last couple of weeks to read. On the 22nd of February 1959, with the ice loaded onto the truck, the expedition set out, with the town's residents lining the streets to see them off. Their route was to cover more than 12,000 kilometres, starting north of the Arctic Circle in Mo i Rana, and then passing through Europe, across the Mediterranean, and down through Africa to the equator. The expedition passed first through various major European cities on their trip south. First Oslo, then Gothenburg, Copenhagen, Hamburg, The Hague, Brussels, and eventually Paris, where a police escort conveyed the unique convoy through the centre of the city past crowds of curious onlookers. By the time the group reached Marseille, where a freighter would take them across the Mediterranean and into Africa, measurements showed that the giant ice block had barely lost 4 litres of water since they had begun the journey. But now disembarking in Algeria in early March 1959, the real test would begin. Coastal temperatures were already topping 25 degrees centigrade and would only get hotter as they drove inland. Ahead of them were hostile deserts, dangerous war zones, and thick, humid jungles, and both the vehicle's capabilities, the expedition members' resolve, and the insulation keeping the block from melting would be pushed to their very limits. In 1954, Algeria, a long-time colonial holding of France, had descended into a brutal war of independence. The National Liberation Front had waged a guerrilla campaign of bombings, ambushes and assassinations, which were met by brutal French counterinsurgency operations. By 1959, as the convoy was passing through, the conflict had already consumed the entire region. French Foreign Legion detachments escorted the team through several stretches and advised them to keep moving, even through punctures or breakdowns, and to avoid any overnight stops outside of the safety of towns. The team made it to the far south of Algeria unscathed, and by the time the convoy reached the edge of the Sahara, they had covered more than 4,000 kilometres. But by now, the roads had increasingly given way to sandy tracks and stony wadis. The vehicles were also starting to show their weaknesses. The overloaded 16-ton Scania, with its 150 horsepower 6-cylinder engine, laboured constantly in second gear and frequently bogged down in the soft sand. To prevent overheating, the front grille was fitted with an additional sand screen, and both radiator and diesel filters had to be painstakingly cleaned twice daily to avoid clogging. The Volkswagen bus, meanwhile, was faring even more poorly in the desert conditions. With rear-wheel drive and narrow tyres, overloaded and underpowered, it stuck constantly in off-road sections, and with its low speed frequently fell behind the convoy on stretches of road. Like the truck, the men had to use steel traction plates, shovels and hand winches to constantly free it. Nevertheless, and to the amazement of the crew, it somehow carried on. It never hurried, only plodded like a stubborn pack animal that had forgotten where it was going. It stuck fast at every dune. We had to dig and push until the sweat poured, while the Scania engine ran as steadily as a clock. The icebox held, no cracks, no leaks, only a steady drip from the drainpipe when the sun stood at its highest. The team had fitted radio sets in the vehicles back in Oslo, but they were unreliable and had been all but abandoned by the time they reached the desert. Sometimes the small convoy would be stretched out miles apart as the team watched the horizon to try and keep track of the other struggling vehicles. Surprisingly, it would be the Porsche that usually fared best. Nimble and light, the relatively unmodified small car, no doubt envisioned in the minds of its German designers for European road trips rather than African deserts, was nevertheless perfectly suited to the conditions, skirting over the top of the dunes where other vehicles had become bogged down. Despite the endless stretches of desert and punishing climate, numerous nomadic tribes and communities eked out an existence across the vast Saharan plains. Outside the occasional stops at small outposts and oases, the team often encountered the nomadic Tuareg people, camel-herding traders who navigated the shifting seas of sand across ancient caravan routes. It was the Tuaregs who had named the next area the convoy was to pass through, the dreaded Tanezruft, the land of fear, so named by the Tuareg people as an area of no oases and no hope of rescue if you ran out of water. By now, the hottest days had reached over 50 degrees centigrade, and inside the truck's cab, thermometers bubbled at nearly 60. The ice container was now sweating about 15 litres every 24 hours, but still less than half of 1% of its total weight per day. By the time they reached Insala, the loss had climbed to around 75 litres. At Taman Rasset, it was around 100 litres. By Agadez, it had risen to 127, and by the 11th of March, the running total had exceeded 141.5 litres. After these long days toiling in the sand, coaxing along and repairing their strange convoy of vehicles, the men would collapse on nights they hadn't reached an outpost or oasis around a makeshift camp. Deep in the desert, hundreds of miles from civilization, they slept beneath the vast canopy of stars, their bizarre cargo of millennia-old ice dripping away in the back of the truck. René Cornet, the French co-driver of the L-75, was an experienced desert driver. He loved the Sahara and would often sit by the campfire praising the endless oceans of sand as the team tried to understand his French and broken Swedish. The Sahara brutally cuts out the half-hearted or rotten. Only the strong and decent survive, those who are willing to do their share. The Sahara does not tolerate empty talk. Those who are not good enough succumb, while those who trust in themselves and their will to succeed experience the deepest liberation. The Sahara was indeed an unforgiving place for those who entered unprepared. Just 4 years earlier, in 1955, another overland party had tried to cross from south to north. Their leader was Alan Cooper, an overconfident and largely unsuccessful businessman who, more than 20 years earlier, had made the crossing in what was then said to be the smallest vehicle yet to cross the Sahara, a 2-seat Morris Minor. This time, Cooper had set out in a Morris Traveller, having convinced 3 individuals, Peter Barnes, Frida Taylor and Barbara Duffy, to pay him £175 each on a journey that was under-equipped and poorly prepared. The car soon became bogged in the sand, and with few supplies and no equipment to recover themselves, Cooper set off on foot to look for help. He died in the heat. Stranded at the vehicle without water, Frida Taylor also died. Their graves were left out in the desert, not far from the route that the ice convoy was now following. After 2 weeks of relentless driving, the odometer read 7,500 kilometres since their departure from Mo i Rana. The geography also began to soften and change. The endless dunes and black rock gave way to the open spaces of the Sahel, the vast transitional zone between the deserts of the Sahara and the southern savannah. Instead of the dry heat and low humidity of the desert, the air was now increasingly thick and sticky, and clouds of insects began to fill the cabs of the vehicles. Tropical storms flooded roads and tracks meters deep, turning the red laterite roads into soapy mud that slid the vehicles sideways. The worsening rains and flooding were also wrecking the expedition's original plans. The intended route onward to Lambaréné became impractical because of the condition of the roads and bridges ahead, forcing the convoy to change course as the meltwater losses ticked above 300 litres. As they closed in on Gabon in the final stages of the journey, they faced one last great obstacle, the vast Agoé River, one of the largest rivers in Africa. But with no proper bridge, only a makeshift ferry of steel beams and planks could be rustled together for the 16-ton lorry and its near 3 tons of ancient Norwegian ice. Almost 3 decades earlier, Italian explorer Attilio Gatti had crossed similar rivers in his vast jungle yachts, purpose-built for expeditions into the Belgian Congo. Now another absurdly oversized vehicle was being edged across equatorial waters, threatening to tip into the river only at the very end of its journey. "If we sink here," Klevan remarked, "the equator will have to come to us." Finally, on the 21st of March 1959, 27 days and roughly 12,000 kilometres after leaving Mo i Rana, the battered convoy reached Lambaréné. By now, both men and machine were close to collapse, but when the lid of the container was finally lifted, a cold mist rolled out from the steel chamber as the crowds of curious onlookers gazed at what was, for many of them, the first ice they had ever seen. But the expedition had brought more than just 3 tons of ancient Norwegian ice. From the beginning, one of the principal aims had been to present the journey as a humanitarian mission, and loaded aboard the L-75 were more than 300 kilograms of medicines supplied by the consortium of sponsors.
Ordfører Granhaug i Mo i Rana undertegner et hilsningsbudskap til dr. Albert Schweitzer på Universitetsplassen i Oslo. Her får isblokkbilen med seg en større forsendelse av medisiner og vitaminpreparater fra norske, svenske og danske leverandører til dr. Schweitzers hospital.
The supplies were destined for Dr. Albert Schweitzer, one of the most famous medical humanitarians in Africa. Schweitzer had founded his hospital at Lambaréné in 1913, building it into one of the most important centres of medicine in equatorial Africa. Only a few years earlier, in 1952, he had travelled to Norway himself to accept the Nobel Peace Prize for his lifelong humanitarian work. As the battered convoy pulled up, the 85-year-old Schweitzer welcomed the exhausted crew and their delivery of essential medicines. But then came the final weighing. After all of Europe, the Sahara, the equatorial rains and delays, the block still weighed 2,714 kilograms. Only 336 litres had been lost along the way, about 11% of the original mass and almost exactly what the Glasvat team had originally calculated. To mark the successful delivery, the ice was soon broken up and handed out to the gathered crowds. For those of us who had travelled 12,000 kilometres from Mo i Rana, it was sad to see the object of all our worries disappear like that, almost thrown to the dogs. When we drained the last water, the ice still stood there, clear and blue as the day we took it from the glacier. We had guarded it like a child for 5 weeks. But, and this is always the question that gets me during these stories, what happened next? What happened to the vehicles after the fact? Well, I'm fairly sure all 3 vehicles made it back to Europe. The men flew home, and it's said that Sivert Klevan, the expedition leader, took with him a few remaining shards of ice from that gigantic block and kept them in a little thermos as ice cubes. And during the premiere of the film about their adventure, he dropped them into the glasses, to toast to the film premiere, which I think is a fantastic story. I also know that the French contingent of sponsors had proposed that the entire expedition get shipped back up to Paris and do like a parade through the city under the Arc de Triomphe, meet the French president at the time, Charles de Gaulle. That didn't happen. Obviously, the ice block was broken up down there. I think because both men and machines were thoroughly exhausted by the time that they got down there to the equator. Now, I'm fairly sure that the sources, or some sources that I found, mentioned that the L-75 was taken back to the company that lent it out. It was a shipping company based out of a town in Sweden, and it was used as a promotional truck for years afterwards at their headquarters. But I can't find that source anymore, which is not the that's why I didn't really include it in the finalized script. As for the Volkswagen bus and the Porsche, I don't know. They seem to disappear off the map. Maybe somewhere out there in a Norwegian, German, French, Swedish shed, there is the Volkswagen and that amazing Porsche. It reminds me quite a lot of one of my favourite Top Gear episodes, the British TV series Top Gear, where they travelled through Africa, the first Africa special. And Richard Hammond, one of the presenters, got a small old Opel, and the presenters laughed at it as a car that would never be able to survive, the conditions of the desert. They crossed the Makadi, which is this incredible dried basin down in Botswana, and the Opel was the only car that managed to do the entire journey without any modifications because it was light and it was nimble and had these narrow little tyres that could navigate anywhere. It reminds me a lot of the Volkswagen Beetles performance in Antarctica. Beetles were famously good performers in the snow. I'll also say that the visuals of taking this massive overloaded truck, the L-75, piled with the medicines and the ice and everything, through the desert and through the jungle, it reminds me of one of my favourite films, which is called Sorcerer, which is it's actually a remake of an older film called Wages of Fear, about these kind of criminals, these kind of mercenaries that are tasked with transporting nitroglycerin dynamite through the jungle in these run-down, broken old vehicles. And there's this incredible famous scene, which many people probably would recognize if they saw it, of them taking the trucks across this jungle bridge. And it's a remarkable scene in the way that it's shot. And I think the way that they are able to characterize these vehicles, to bring them to life, to make them look like these huge, lumbering, almost Lovecraftian monsters, I think is absolutely fantastic. A brilliant film, worth looking up. Just even that scene alone, for a remarkable use of creating characters out of machines and vehicles, which obviously interests me a lot. But was the promotion successful? Well, by all accounts, yes. Glasvat benefited for decades from this story of transporting an ice block through the Sahara Desert. In fact, Sivert Klevan went on the record saying in an interview, I believe on the 50th anniversary of the event, 2009, that to that day, he was still approached regularly and asked about the expedition. And a few years after that, Glasvat sold to a French consortium. It's now called Glava, and it sold for billions. So for many, many years afterwards, the company did incredibly well, helped in part by their incredible promotional abilities to show and demonstrate the extreme capability of their product. But yes, a story of a big truck in the past doing unusual things in an exotic place that most people haven't heard of. It doesn't get much more Callum than that. And a big thanks to my Patreons over at patreon.com/CallumRassi. A big thank you to them and to you guys, as always, for your patience. I haven't been able to upload in a while because, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, I have been spending most of my time when I've not been researching insulation on the back of a truck going through the Sahara, insulating the house that I am building currently here on the Isle of Raasay. So it has been a busy time, to say the least. Juggling that and having a baby and all sorts. Big thanks to everyone that watched, though. Really enjoyed putting this together. Really, really good fun. And a big thanks to my friends over at Planetwild, of course, as well, too. If you want to support real, practical conservation work, check the link in the description below or the little QR code that I've got on the screen on this side right here, just right there. And of course, if you want to just know more about their work, I'll leave a link in the end cards here to their latest mission video and, of course, to that really interesting one about the Scottish forests as well, too. So thanks again to Planetwild. Thanks again to you guys for watching. And I'll see you next time. I better get up to the house now and start insulating. Bye-bye.